My name is Joanna, and at 34 years old, I found myself standing in the marble foyer of a sprawling Connecticut estate, holding freshly signed divorce papers, while my mother-in-law screamed in my face. The ink on the dissolution agreement was barely dry. Beatrice stood blocking the heavy mahogany front doors, her face twisted in absolute disgust, while my husband Preston stood just behind her. Clinging to his arm was Vanessa, the newly hired public relations director, wearing a smug smile and a diamond necklace that looked incredibly familiar. "Do not ever set foot in my house again!" Beatrice shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You take your cheap clothes and your pathetic little consulting business and get out. You are nothing but a gold digger who failed." I did not cry. I did not scream back or beg for my marriage. Instead, I calmly adjusted the belt of my trench coat and reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a separate stack of heavy watermarked documents and handed them to her. I smiled, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them all uncomfortable. "Actually, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I already sold this house yesterday afternoon to a commercial developer who plans to bulldoze it. And as for your son, his board is about to remove him as chief executive officer." I watched the color drain completely from Beatrice's face. Before she could even formulate a response, Preston's phone began ringing frantically with alerts from his board of directors. But before I show you exactly how a supposedly helpless housewife orchestrated the most ruthless, legally airtight corporate takeover of the decade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through disrespect while secretly plotting your revenge. To understand how we reached that explosive moment in the foyer, you have to go back exactly 8 months. It was late October, and the annual Autumn Charity Gala was in full swing at the Ridgewood Country Club. The ballroom was a sea of expensive silk-tailored tuxedos and forced laughter. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of champagne, while the local elite patted each other on the back for their philanthropy. Preston was in his element. As the chief executive officer of his family's logistics firm, he treated these events less like charity functions and more like an extension of his boardroom. He glad-handed politicians, charmed local business owners, and basked in the attention. I stood quietly by his side, playing the role of the supportive, quiet wife he always wanted me to be. Beatrice naturally was the chairwoman of the gala. She floated through the room like royalty, wearing a gown that cost more than some people earn in a year. She had never approved of our marriage. To Beatrice, I lacked the proper pedigree. I did not come from old money, I did not attend the right prep schools, and I did not care about country club politics. About midway through the evening, Beatrice corralled a group of wealthy socialites and dragged them over to where Preston and I were standing. She kissed Preston on both cheeks, praising him loudly for a recent quarterly report she barely understood. Then she turned her sharp, calculating eyes on me. "And of course, we have Joanna," Beatrice announced to the circle of women, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure everyone nearby could hear. "My son, the brilliant chief executive officer, works so hard to keep this family afloat. He carries the weight of the entire corporation on his shoulders. And Joanna here does freelance consulting from home just to feel useful. It is so cute that she tries to contribute." A few of the women offered tight, uncomfortable smiles while others openly snickered behind their champagne flutes. Preston did not defend me. He simply chuckled, wrapping an arm around my waist and giving it a condescending squeeze. He told the group that it kept me busy and out of trouble, treating my career like a child's hobby. The disrespect burned. For years, this had been the dynamic. They painted me as the lucky charity case who managed to secure a wealthy husband, the dependent wife who needed their grace to survive. They loved the narrative of my helplessness because it fueled their massive egos. I did not argue with Beatrice or cause a scene that would only validate her opinion of me. Instead, I offered a serene, polished smile. I took a slow sip of my champagne, looked Beatrice directly in the eyes, and agreed that Preston certainly had his hands full at the office. What Beatrice and Preston did not know, what no one in that suffocating ballroom knew, was that I was not a struggling freelance consultant trying to pass the time. My silence was not submission, it was strategy. Every insult, every slight, every public humiliation was just another piece of data I was silently collecting. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous person in the room is never the one shouting for attention. It is the one quietly observing, letting their enemies underestimate them. As the gala dragged on into the late evening, the air in the ballroom grew thick and stifling. Preston was deep in a conversation with a local politician, entirely ignoring my presence. Vanessa was hovering nearby, laughing a little too loudly at Preston's jokes, and touching his arm with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. I had noticed her boundary-crossing behavior for weeks, but tonight it felt bolder, more blatant. Deciding I had endured enough torture, I approached Preston, claiming a headache. He barely looked at me, waving a dismissive hand and telling me to take the driver while he finished networking. I slipped out without saying goodbye. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I walked down the stone steps, bringing immediate relief. The valet brought my car, and I sank into the leather seat, eager to return home. I drove through the winding, tree-lined streets of Connecticut, letting the soft hum of the radio soothe my frayed nerves. I just wanted to take off my heels, wash the heavy makeup from my face, and sleep. But as I pulled onto our street, I reached into my designer clutch to find my keys. My fingers met empty space. I pulled over and dumped the contents of my purse onto the passenger seat. No keys. Frustration bubbled up. Then I remembered our chaotic morning. Preston had accidentally grabbed my keyring off the kitchen counter while rushing out. He had texted me later saying he left them on his desk at the corporate office. I sighed heavily. I could not get into the house without them, and the security system would trigger an alarm if I used the emergency keypad without the fob. I had no choice. I put the car in drive and headed back toward the downtown business district. The streets were empty. The logistics firm occupied the top 3 floors of a prominent high-rise. I pulled into the underground garage, using my spouse access badge to swipe through the gates. The building was dark and silent. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt unusually long. I stepped onto the plush carpet, the only sound being the soft click of my heels in the dim hallway. I walked down the corridor toward Preston's corner office, intending only to grab my keys from his desk and leave. But as I approached the heavy double doors, I noticed a sliver of light spilling out from underneath. I paused, my hand hovering over the brass handle. That was when I heard the sound that would shatter the illusion of my marriage and set the destruction of their empire into motion. Muffled laughter and a low, unmistakable voice echoed from within. My heart slammed against my ribs as I pressed my hand against the cold wood, preparing to push the door open. Before I could apply any pressure to the heavy oak, my phone vibrated violently against my hip. The sudden buzzing and the dead silence of the dim hallway made me jolt. I quickly pulled my hand back from the brass handle, stepping away from that betraying sliver of light. I moved quietly back down the corridor, putting physical distance between myself and the muffled sounds escaping from my husband's office. I pulled the phone from my coat pocket, expecting it to be Preston, wondering where I was. Instead, the bright screen illuminated with a name I had carefully saved under a very discreet alias to avoid any unnecessary questions. It was Harrison, my primary wealth manager. I accepted the call, keeping my voice to a hushed whisper. We had a scheduled quarterly review for the following morning, and Harrison was notorious for calling late at night with urgent portfolio updates. He was a brilliant financial strategist who operated out of a high-security office in Manhattan. He quickly asked if it was a very bad time to talk. I told him I was standing in the hallway of Preston's corporate headquarters, retrieving my forgotten house keys. Harrison apologized for the late interruption, but mentioned a significant shift in the tech sector regarding my blind trust that required my immediate verbal authorization. As Harrison listed off profit margins and market projections, my mind drifted to the reality that Preston and his mother Beatrice knew absolutely nothing about. They looked at me and saw a quaint freelance consultant playing at business just to pass the time. They saw a dependent wife who needed the legacy of their family logistics firm to survive in high society. The actual truth was entirely different. When I was 28 years old, long before Preston and I ever crossed paths, I built a boutique data analytics firm from the ground up. I grew up in a fiercely independent working-class family where every single dollar was earned through sweat and sacrifice. My parents taught me the value of hard work and self-reliance. I learned early on how to read complex market trends and how to build algorithms that predicted supply chain failures with stunning accuracy. My analytics firm became highly sought after by major corporations. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing sleep to build my company into an industry leader. I missed out on vacations, holidays, and normal social events just to keep my business growing at an exponential rate. Eventually, a massive tech conglomerate recognized the immense value of my proprietary software and bought me out for mid-eight figures. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to ensure I would never have to worry about anything ever again. But rather than flaunt my newfound wealth, I did something that confused everyone around me. I placed the entire payout into a heavily guarded blind trust. I knew the kind of people that sudden wealth attracted. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what my bank accounts could provide. I wanted to protect my autonomy above all else. When I met Preston, he was charming, driven, and the heir apparent to his family's vast logistics empire. He seemed like a man who had his own success and would not need to feed off mine. But as I spent more time around Beatrice and the rest of his status-obsessed relatives, I quickly realized how toxic their relationship with money truly was. They measured human worth in country club memberships, designer labels, and public displays of wealth. If they had known about my eight-figure trust, they would have drained it to fund their lavish lifestyle. Or worse, they would have used me as a prop in their superficial high society games, parading my success around to inflate their own egos. So I kept my mouth shut. I maintained a modest freelance consulting business, managing a few select clients to keep my skills sharp and provide a plausible cover story for my income. Harrison was the only person who knew the full extent of my financial autonomy. He managed the diverse investments, ensured my strict anonymity, and acted as the loyal gatekeeper to my empire. Over the years, under his careful guidance, my initial eight-figure payout had grown substantially. I was a woman who understood numbers, strategy, and leverage. I did not need Preston's money, but I played the part of the grateful wife because I genuinely loved him and believed we were building a life based on mutual respect. Harrison's voice brought me back to the present moment. He told me the recent investments we made in renewable energy had yielded another massive return. He asked if I wanted to reallocate the new dividends back into the main trust or keep them liquid in my private accounts. I looked down the long, shadowed hallway of the logistics firm. I told Harrison to keep the assets liquid. I had a very strange feeling I might need immediate access to significant capital soon. Harrison paused, sensing the unusual tension in my voice. He asked if I was all right and if I needed him to arrange a car or security. I told him I was fine, just tired from enduring the charity gala and dealing with Beatrice. I promised to review the detailed financial reports he sent over our secure server as soon as I got home. We ended the call and I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The corridor was silent again. The brief interruption had given my racing heart a chance to slow down. I leaned against the cool wallpapered wall, taking a deep breath to center myself. I am not a woman who panics. I do not act on pure emotion without assessing the data first. My entire career was built on evaluating complex situations and making rational, calculated decisions. I looked back toward the heavy double doors of the executive suite. The sliver of light was still there, glowing like a warning sign in the dark. The muffled laughter continued, now punctuated by a low, rhythmic thudding against the wall. They were the undeniable sounds of two people engaged in something deeply intimate and entirely inappropriate for a corporate office. I pushed off the wall and began to walk back toward the office. My steps were slow and deliberate. With every soft click of my heels against the plush carpet, I felt the illusions of my marriage breaking apart. I thought about the vows Preston and I took, promising loyalty and honesty. I thought about the life we built together, the home we shared, the future we had planned. I thought about how easily he had dismissed me at the gala earlier tonight, laughing along with his mother as she publicly tore me down. He had traded my genuine loyalty for the superficial admiration of his country club friends and the cheap thrill of an office affair. I reached the door once more. My hand no longer trembled. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that my secret wealth was not just a safety net anymore. It was about to become a powerful weapon. I did not knock. I did not announce my presence to give them a chance to scramble and hide. I simply placed my right hand firmly on the cold brass handle and pushed the heavy oak door wide open, stepping directly into the bright office light. The heavy oak door swung open without a single sound. The soft ambient light from the desk lamp cut across the spacious room, illuminating the imported Italian leather sofa in the far corner. There they were, my husband and Vanessa, the newly hired director of public relations. The scene playing out in front of me was exactly what you would expect from a cheap corporate affair. Tangled clothes, a spilled glass of red wine, and the sudden freezing realization that they were no longer alone in the executive suite. Vanessa gasped loudly and scrambled backward, frantically pulling her blouse up to cover her shoulders. Her eyes were wide with a brief flash of genuine panic, but that panic quickly morphed into a smug, defiant glare when she realized I was not going to scream. I stood planted in the doorway, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely blank. I felt the initial shock hit my chest like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. But I refused to let that pain show on my face. I had trained myself to lock my emotions away when dealing with volatile situations. Right now, I needed to observe everything. I watched Preston process my unexpected presence. A decent man caught betraying his loyal wife would have tripped over himself trying to apologize. He would have dropped to his knees, begged for forgiveness, or at least shown a tiny shred of human remorse. But Preston was not a decent man. He slowly stood up, taking his sweet time to button his shirt and adjust his silk tie. He let out a long, exasperated sigh, as if I were a misbehaving child who had just interrupted an important business call. He ran a hand through his styled hair and offered me an arrogant smirk. "Well, Joanna," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I suppose this saves us the trouble of having a very awkward conversation at home later this week." He poured himself a fresh glass of bourbon from the crystal decanter on his desk, taking a casual sip before leaning against the mahogany wood. Vanessa mirrored his confidence, crossing her arms and watching me from the sofa. She seemed to be waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the hysterical weeping wife trope to play out for her entertainment. I did not give them the satisfaction. I remained silent, letting my eyes drift from the spilled wine to Preston's arrogant face. My silence seemed to irritate him. He set his glass down a bit too hard, making the crystal clink sharply against the wood. "Do not stand there trying to figure out a way to ruin my life, Joanna," he warned, taking a step toward me. He pointed a finger in my direction, shifting instantly from a cheating husband to an aggressive corporate bully. "If you are thinking about running to the press or causing a massive scandal for my family, you need to think very carefully about your next move. Because if you try to make this difficult for me, my lawyers will absolutely destroy you." He paced across the room. He reminded me that he had the best corporate attorneys in the entire state on his payroll. He told me they would drag my name through the mud and bury me in so many legal fees that I would be working in a diner just to pay them off. "You walked into this marriage with nothing," he declared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "And if you cross me, you will walk out with exactly that. Nothing. My family built a company that is worth millions of dollars. Millions, Joanna. We have assets and power that you cannot even begin to comprehend. And your name is not on a single one of those assets. You do not own the house. You do not own the cars. You do not own a single share of this company. You are entitled to zero." He stepped right up to me, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He expected me to shrink back. He expected me to cry, to beg him not to throw me out on the street, to submit to his demands just to survive. He was banking on the illusion he and his mother had created, that I was a helpless, dependent woman who desperately needed their wealth to exist in the world. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the expensive bourbon and Vanessa's perfume clinging to his skin. So, here is what is going to happen, he whispered harshly. You are going to go back to the house, pack a bag, and wait for my instructions. We will handle this divorce quietly and cleanly. If you behave, I might write you a small check to help you get an apartment. If you fight me, I will make sure you are left completely destitute. Do you understand me? What Preston did not know was that his threats were the greatest gift he could have ever given me. By showing his true colors so completely, he erased any lingering doubt or guilt I might have felt about destroying him. He had just declared war on a woman he knew absolutely nothing about. He thought he held all the cards because he had a few $1 million and a team of lawyers. He had no idea he was threatening a woman sitting on an 8-figure fortune who built predictive data models for fun. I did not scream. I simply gave him a single nod. I understand, Preston, I said, my voice entirely steady. I turned around and walked out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I heard Vanessa let out a victorious laugh as the latch clicked into place. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully broken me and secured their neat little happy ending. I walked down the hallway, my mind already shifting into a clinical strategic gear. I did not head for the elevators to leave the building. Instead, I turned down a secondary corridor that led toward the administrative wing. I had visited the corporate office enough times over the years to know the layout perfectly. More importantly, I knew where the central data servers were housed. I stopped in front of the server room door. It was secured by a biometric lock and a numeric keypad. Preston thought I was just a freelance consultant who barely understood modern technology. He never bothered to change the master administrative codes that he had casually mentioned to me months ago when complaining about the IT department. I punched the numbers into the keypad and the light turned green. I slipped inside the cool climate-controlled room, closing the door securely behind me. The hum of the massive server towers surrounded me. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a small encrypted bypass drive I kept for my own data security emergencies. My fingers flew across the terminal keyboard with practiced precision. I bypassed the main firewall, routing my connection through a ghost server to avoid triggering any internal security alerts. I plugged the drive into the mainframe and initiated a silent clone of the company's financial database. Every hidden account, every single piece of data they had. I would ensure that their entire arrogant world burned completely down around them. The progress bar on my laptop screen inched toward 100%. When the notification chimed indicating the transfer was complete, I safely ejected the drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat. I left the server room exactly as I had found it, erasing my digital footprint from the access logs with a few quick commands. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cool night air, avoiding the main entrance where the security guard was stationed. I retrieved my car from the underground garage and drove away from the downtown district. I did not go back to the Connecticut estate. Preston and Vanessa were likely still celebrating their supposed victory, and I needed absolute privacy to review the massive amount of information I had just acquired. Instead, I drove to the outskirts of the city and checked into a cheap roadside motel using cash. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and bleach, but it offered exactly what I needed: anonymity and a stable internet connection. I locked the flimsy door, engaged the deadbolt, and pulled the thin curtains shut against the glow of the neon vacancy sign outside. I sat down at the small, scratched laminate desk and opened my laptop. The only light in the room came from the bright glare of the screen illuminating the cheap floral bedspread behind me. I plugged in the encrypted drive and began the decryption process. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. This was my element. Raw data never lied. It did not have an ego. It did not make empty threats, and it did not cheat. It simply told the truth. As the files populated on my screen, I initiated a series of diagnostic scripts I had written years ago during my time running the analytics firm. These scripts were designed to comb through millions of lines of financial data and instantly highlight discrepancies, liabilities, and irregular cash flows. I sat back and watched the numbers cascade down the monitor. Beatrice and Preston had spent years cultivating the image of an untouchable corporate dynasty. They paraded around the country club boasting about unprecedented quarterly gains and massive logistical expansions. They looked down on anyone who actually had to work for a living, assuming their generational wealth made them inherently superior. But as the true financial health of the logistics company took shape before my eyes, I almost let out a laugh. Preston was not a business genius. He was a complete and utter fraud. The company was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. Revenue had plummeted over the last 3 years, and client retention was at an all-time low. The supposedly booming empire was actually a hollow shell desperately trying to stay afloat. Preston had been shifting money between various shell accounts to create the illusion of profitability, masking a mountain of toxic debt. He was taking out massive high-interest corporate loans just to make payroll and cover operational costs. I dug deeper into the expense reports, narrowing my search parameters to executive spending. The sheer audacity of his financial mismanagement was staggering. While the logistics fleet was operating with outdated equipment and vendors were going unpaid for months, Preston was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the operational budget for his personal enjoyment. I found receipts for chartered private jets, luxury suites in Paris, and exclusive golf club memberships hidden under the guise of corporate retreats and client acquisition expenses. Then I found the vendor invoices for Vanessa. Preston had not just hired his mistress, he had practically put her on a corporate shopping spree. There were itemized bills for designer handbags, imported shoes, and fine dining, all charged to a discreet company credit card. I found the invoice for the diamond necklace Vanessa had been wearing on the leather sofa earlier that night. It was billed as a public relations promotional expense. The level of incompetence was almost offensive to someone who had built a legitimate business from the ground up. He was treating a multi-million-dollar corporation like his own personal piggy bank, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire structure was on the verge of total collapse. I rubbed my tired eyes and took a sip of the lukewarm tap water I had poured earlier. I was about to close the expense files when an anomaly in the collateral registry caught my attention. It was a restricted folder heavily encrypted and buried deep within the legal department archives. My fingers moved quickly, deploying a brute force algorithm to crack the password. When the folder finally opened, I found myself staring at a series of scanned legal documents that made my blood run cold. It was a commercial loan agreement with a predatory private equity firm. Preston had secured an emergency injection of capital a few months ago to prevent the company from going into immediate receivership, but the private equity firm had demanded substantial physical collateral to underwrite such a massive risk. Preston did not have sufficient corporate assets to pledge. Instead, he had leveraged the one thing his mother valued above everything else in the world. He had put up Beatrice's cherished ancestral mansion as collateral for the loan. I leaned closer to the screen, reading through the fine print of the property deed and the appended signature pages. My eyes scanned the notary's seals and the signatures at the bottom of the agreement. Beatrice's signature was there, perfectly forged. Preston had illegally signed his own mother's name to leverage the Connecticut estate behind her back. He had gambled the very roof over her head to buy himself a few more months of playing the wealthy executive. The terms of the loan were absolutely brutal. The grace period for the quarterly payment was rapidly approaching, and the penalty for defaulting meant the private equity firm could immediately initiate a silent foreclosure and seize the property without a lengthy court battle. Preston had handed the keys to his family legacy over to ruthless creditors just to keep Vanessa draped in diamonds. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal gave me everything I needed. I now possessed the blueprint to dismantle his entire life. Just as I saved a secure copy of the forged deed to my remote server, the harsh silence of the motel room was broken by a sharp vibration against the laminate desk. My phone buzzed with an incoming automated alert from my primary banking institution. I picked up the device and opened the notification. It was a joint account update. Preston had just emptied our shared checking and savings accounts, transferring every single dollar into a private account solely under his name. A second alert followed immediately after notifying me that my primary credit cards had been completely canceled. He was moving fast, trying to cut off my resources before I could even formulate a plan to hire an attorney. My phone buzzed one final time with a text message from Preston. The message was brief and dripping with the arrogant confidence of a man who thought he had just won the war. He truly believed that severing my access to those meager marital funds would leave me entirely helpless, terrified, and crawling back to him begging for his ultimate mercy and forgiveness. He wrote, "Good luck surviving on your own." I stared at the glowing screen, reading his pathetic attempt to starve me into submission. I set it down. For several minutes, I sat perfectly still, listening to the cheap air conditioner rattle against the motel wall. Preston believed he had removed every practical option available to me. He had emptied the joint accounts, canceled the cards, and sent a message designed to make me feel abandoned. What he had actually done was create a clean record of financial coercion less than an hour after threatening me in his office. I photographed every banking alert, exported the transaction history, and saved his text message in 3 encrypted locations. Then I created a chronological incident file beginning with the charity gala and ending with the exact minute he transferred the marital funds. Evidence was only useful if it could survive scrutiny. I opened the metadata attached to the cloned corporate files and checked the internal timestamps against the company server clock. I preserved the original copies without altering a single byte and generated digital fingerprints for every folder. The working copies went into a separate encrypted partition where I could analyze them without contaminating the source material. I had spent years building systems that proved where information came from and whether it had been changed. Preston had dismissed that work as technical trivia. Now the same discipline would make it difficult for him to claim the records were fabricated. I started with the loan documents. The private equity agreement identified 3 separate lenders, each holding a different portion of the logistics company's distressed obligations. The largest controlled the collateral rights attached to the Connecticut estate. The others controlled liens against the truck fleet, the downtown headquarters, and several regional warehouses. Preston had divided the company into pieces and pledged almost every valuable asset without informing his board. If one lender panicked, the others would follow. That weakness created an opportunity, but only if I moved before Preston realized how close he was to default. I opened a secure application and sent Harrison a coded request to activate the emergency protocol we had designed years earlier. Less than a minute later, he appeared on my screen from his Manhattan office. He did not ask why I was calling before dawn. He studied my face and told me to begin at the beginning. I gave him a controlled summary finding Preston with Vanessa, the threats, the copied records, the forged signature, the hidden loans, and the emptied accounts. Harrison remained silent until I finished. Then his expression hardened. He asked whether I wanted protection investigators or immediate litigation. I told him I wanted all 3 eventually, but first I wanted leverage. I shared the lender's schedule through our secure server. Harrison reviewed the figures and confirmed the debt was deeply distressed. The lenders were receiving late payments, the company had violated performance covenants, and the collateral values were beginning to decline. A quiet buyer offering immediate liquidity could purchase those obligations for far less than their face value, especially if the buyer promised confidentiality and a rapid closing. Harrison asked whether I understood what acquiring the debt would mean. I told him I did. I would not be buying Preston's company in the traditional sense. I would be buying the pressure surrounding it. Every missed payment would increase my authority. Every careless decision would narrow his options. If structured correctly, the creditors could transfer their enforcement rights to a private holding company without revealing my identity. Preston would believe a faceless investment group had rescued him while I quietly gained control of the assets he had already placed at risk. We needed a name with no visible connection to me. Harrison opened the dormant corporate registry maintained for my trust and selected an entity created years earlier for potential acquisitions. It had no employees' public website or operational history linking it to my consulting work. The name was Apex Holdings. I authorized Harrison to capitalize it with liquid assets from my private accounts and retain an outside law firm that had never represented Preston, his family, or the logistics company. Every communication would pass through independent counsel. My name would remain hidden behind the trust until disclosure became strategically useful. Harrison warned me that buying the debt would not automatically give me control of the family voting shares. Preston still believed his mother's interest protected him. We would need a second mechanism, a voluntary acknowledgement signed by Preston, one that converted creditor enforcement rights into temporary voting authority if the company entered unrecoverable default. It had to be legal, visible in the text, and impossible to challenge as forgery. The only advantage we could use was Preston's arrogance. He rarely read documents he believed were routine, especially when signing them made him feel victorious. Harrison said his corporate litigators could draft the language, but creating the opportunity for Preston to sign it would require patience. I told him the divorce would provide that opportunity. Preston had already threatened to bury me in legal paperwork. We would let him create the mountain and place one carefully designed page inside it. Nothing would be altered after his signature. He would receive every warning an ordinary executive should need. If he ignored them, the consequences would belong to him. Next, we discussed the mansion. The forged signature complicated enforcement because Beatrice could argue that she never authorized the collateral pledge. But the records showed that the property had been transferred years earlier into a family management entity controlled jointly by Preston and Beatrice. Preston possessed limited authority to enter commercial agreements for that entity, though he had exceeded that authority and concealed the transaction. Harrison believed the collateral claim might still be enforceable, but he insisted we verify the chain of title in every corporate resolution before moving. I agreed. Revenge built on weak paperwork was only another form of recklessness. Every action had to survive review by judges, auditors, regulators, and hostile attorneys. Harrison would retain a real estate specialist to examine the deed management entity loan covenants and foreclosure provisions. Forensic accountants would independently verify the embezzlement records. We would obtain lawful copies from lenders, vendors, banks, and public filings, so the final case could stand, even if the cloned database was challenged. Before ending the call, Harrison asked where I intended to stay. I told him I would not return to the estate. He arranged a furnished apartment owned by one of our holding entities, a place Preston could not connect to my trust through a casual search. He also assigned a security consultant to monitor the building without approaching me unless necessary. Preston had already shown how quickly humiliation could turn into aggression. Strategy required acknowledging risk, not pretending I was immune to it. The first light of morning began to appear around the curtains. Harrison summarized our priorities. Preserve the evidence. Verify every liability. Quietly approach the creditors. Capitalize Apex Holdings. Keep my ownership hidden. Allow Preston to believe I was frightened and isolated. Most importantly, do nothing that would warn him to examine the foundations of his empire. I looked at Preston's final message again. Good luck surviving on your own. He thought survival meant access to his accounts, his home, and his family name. He had never understood that I had built a life before him and could build another after him. I answered nothing. I placed the phone face down beside the laptop and began preparing the files Harrison's team would need when the markets opened. I spent the rest of that night in the motel meticulously organizing the cloned files on my encrypted drive. When morning finally broke through the thin curtains, I felt no exhaustion. I only felt a hyper-focused drive. I knew Preston would act swiftly to establish dominance, so I had to prepare my defenses carefully. Less than 48 hours later, the official divorce papers arrived at the small rented apartment I had secured under a corporate alias. Preston had filed citing irreconcilable differences. His lawyer included a strongly worded letter demanding my immediate cooperation and suggesting I retain counsel, though they both knew Preston had frozen my access to our marital funds. They expected me to panic and scramble for a cheap public defender or a discount family lawyer. I decided to play right into their hands. I hired a perfectly average, unremarkable divorce attorney named David. He was a kind man, competent enough, but easily intimidated by the massive corporate law firm representing my husband. David reviewed the initial filing and looked at me with deep sympathy, warning me that fighting a family with this level of wealth and power would be an incredibly uphill battle. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the anxious, overwhelmed wife, while silently knowing that David was just a necessary prop in my much larger production. 3 weeks later, David and I attended the first court-ordered case management conference in a modest hearing room inside the Hartford Courthouse Annex. It was not a settlement session. There were no panoramic windows, crystal water glasses, or polished mahogany walls designed to impress anyone. The room contained a long laminate table, a court reporter, and a magistrate whose expression suggested she had no patience for theatrical displays. That suited me perfectly. I did not need Preston to make an offer that day. I needed him to place his version of reality on the official record. Preston arrived 10 minutes late with his lead attorney and an assistant carrying 2 leather document cases. He wore a dark navy suit and the relaxed smile of a man attending a routine administrative formality. He barely acknowledged me. His attorney immediately apologized for the delay, blaming an emergency board call involving what he described as the company's extraordinary growth. Preston nodded as if the entire courthouse should feel privileged to have him present. The magistrate began by explaining that both parties would be required to exchange complete financial disclosures before final mediation. Every account liability business, interest trust, property interest, and significant transfer made during the marriage had to be identified under penalty of perjury. Preston's attorney interrupted to say the process was unnecessary because his client intended to offer a simple walk-away settlement. He claimed there were no meaningful marital assets in dispute because the family company and the Connecticut estate were protected by premarital ownership structures. David shifted nervously beside me. He had spent the previous week practicing the mannerisms of an overwhelmed neighborhood attorney who had wandered into a case far beyond his experience. He cleared his throat twice before asking whether Preston would be willing to certify those statements in writing. Preston's lawyer smiled with open contempt and said, "Of course." David then asked a series of apparently clumsy questions, pausing often to search through his notes. Was the logistics company financially stable? Preston laughed and said it was stronger than it had ever been. Were there any emergency loans, undisclosed liens, creditor negotiations, or pending defaults that could affect the value of the company? Preston leaned back and answered no. Had any family property been pledged as collateral for corporate obligations? His attorney began to object that the question was irrelevant, but Preston waved him off. He declared that his family did not need to risk personal property to obtain financing. According to him, the company generated more than enough cash to support its expansion. The court reporter captured every word. I kept my eyes lowered and pretended to study the blank page in front of me. Inside, I was cataloging each statement against the files on my encrypted drive. Preston was not merely exaggerating. He was creating a formal record directly contradicted by loan agreements, bank transfers, and collateral schedules bearing his signature. The more confidently he lied, the more useful the hearing became. David continued. He asked whether Preston personally controlled corporate spending and whether any other executive possessed authority to approve large discretionary expenses. Preston boasted that every major payment required his direct authorization because he refused to let incompetent subordinates jeopardize the family legacy. That answer connected him to the private flights, luxury hotels, vehicle purchases, and jewelry expenses without David mentioning a single suspicious transaction. The magistrate glanced over her glasses and reminded Preston that the financial certification would carry legal consequences. For the first time, his attorney looked uneasy. He placed a hand on Preston's sleeve and whispered something. Preston pulled away, irritated by the caution. He said he understood exactly what he was signing and had nothing to hide. Then his attorney turned the attention toward me. He described my consulting work as inconsistent, minor, and incapable of producing substantial income. He demanded disclosure of every client payment I had received during the marriage. I allowed David to appear embarrassed, as he admitted that my records were still being organized. Preston smirked. He told the magistrate that my business was little more than a hobby and that he had supported our entire household. The statement did not endanger my trust. The buyout proceeds predated the marriage, remained inside a protected structure, and had never been commingled with marital accounts. Harrison's tax attorneys had reviewed every detail. Still, I needed Preston to believe he had discovered the outer limit of my resources. I opened my handbag, removed a thin folder containing the modest consulting statements we had prepared, and slid it toward David with deliberately shaking hands. Preston watched the folder cross the table and visibly relaxed. He saw small monthly invoices, ordinary software subscriptions, and the rent for my new apartment. Everything reinforced the picture he wanted to believe. I looked like a woman attempting to survive on a business that barely covered her expenses. The magistrate issued deadlines for the formal exchange. Preston had 7 days to provide sworn corporate and personal disclosures. I had the same. She also prohibited either party from hiding, transferring, or destroying marital assets while the case remained pending. Preston's attorney objected to the restriction, arguing that it could interfere with normal corporate operations. The magistrate replied that legitimate operations would not be affected and that unusual transfers would require explanation. As the conference ended, David made one final request. In a timid voice, he asked whether Preston could sign a short acknowledgement confirming the answers he had given that morning, so both sides would know what documents were still needed. Preston's attorney started reading the 2-page form carefully. Preston snatched it from him. He scanned only the first lines, saw that it summarized his claims of financial stability and sole executive authority, and signed at the bottom with an impatient flourish. He had no idea that the acknowledgement would later help prove knowledge control and deliberate concealment. It did not transfer a single share or give me any new rights. It simply locked Preston into a story he could not maintain once the verified records appeared. Outside the courthouse, David kept his shoulders rounded until we reached the parking structure. The moment the elevator doors closed, his posture changed. He handed me a certified copy of Preston's signed acknowledgement and said the court reporter would deliver the transcript within 48 hours. I called Harrison from the privacy of my car. I told him Preston had denied every hidden loan, claimed the mansion was unencumbered, and accepted personal responsibility for major corporate spending. Harrison understood immediately. The sworn disclosures would force Preston either to reveal the defaults or commit further misrepresentation. Both outcomes benefited us. I instructed Harrison to proceed with the creditor outreach through Apex Holdings. There was no need to rush the final strike. Preston had just given us something more valuable than a settlement offer. He had placed his arrogance on the record, signed his name beneath it, and walked away believing the meeting had been a waste of his time. The shell company would systematically devour his legacy while he was busy popping champagne and celebrating a hollow victory he had not truly earned. Less than 2 days after that mediation session, my phone vibrated with an unexpected message. It was an invitation from Beatrice. The text was worded with a sickeningly sweet tone that I knew was fake. She claimed she wanted to host a small, amicable family dinner at the Connecticut estate. She wrote that since the divorce was proceeding smoothly, we should clear the air and part ways with dignity. I stared at the message and almost laughed. Beatrice did not know the meaning of the word amicable. Her entire social existence was built on dominating others. I knew with absolute certainty this dinner was a trap designed purely for my public humiliation. She wanted an audience to watch me grovel before I was officially banished. I typed back a polite acceptance. I needed to keep playing the part of the defeated wife just a little bit longer. I arrived at the estate on Saturday evening, parking my sedan between luxury vehicles. The grand house looked exactly the same as when I left it, but knowing the property was secretly teetering on the edge of a massive foreclosure changed how I viewed the towering stone pillars. It was no longer a fortress of generational wealth. It was a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. I walked up the brick steps and rang the doorbell. A housekeeper ushered me into the formal dining room. Beatrice had gathered a curated audience of extended relatives and country club friends. They were sipping wine and chatting in hushed tones, waiting for the main event. Preston was sitting at the head of the mahogany table looking incredibly pleased with himself. Sitting beside him in the chair that used to be mine was Vanessa. She offered a mockingly sympathetic wave as I took the only available seat at the far end of the table. The dinner was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. Beatrice directed the conversation toward the booming success of the logistics company, loudly praising Preston for his brilliant corporate maneuvering. They discussed luxury vacations, deliberately highlighting a lifestyle they believed I was about to lose forever. I ate my salad quietly, offering polite nods and keeping my posture subdued. I let them enjoy their collective delusion. When the plates were cleared, Beatrice rose and tapped the side of her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The conversation stopped immediately. She announced that because the marriage was ending, the family needed to preserve an accurate record of what each person had contributed. Her tone was ceremonial, almost charitable, but the excitement in her eyes revealed the cruelty underneath. Preston reached beneath his chair and lifted a large leather presentation folder onto the table. Beatrice opened it and removed a professionally printed document titled Final Family Accounting. She had listed the estimated cost of every vacation, dinner, holiday gift, and year of residence she believed her family had provided during my marriage. Beside my name, she had written "zero contribution" in bold red ink. She passed copies around the table as if she were distributing a corporate report. Several relatives studied the invented figures with embarrassed expressions. Others smiled because they understood exactly what the performance was designed to accomplish. Beatrice explained that the document would protect the family's reputation if I later claimed I had helped build their success. She wanted every person in the room to serve as a witness that I had entered the marriage with nothing and was leaving with more generosity than I deserved. Then she placed a silver pen beside the folder and pushed both toward me. She asked me to sign the final page, acknowledging that Preston had financially supported me, that I had contributed no measurable value to the family, and that I would never publicly associate myself with the Kensington name after the divorce. Preston leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. Vanessa sat in the place that had once been mine, watching me with open amusement. Resting against her collarbone was the teardrop diamond necklace I had traced through the corporate expense accounts. Under the chandelier light, it flashed every time she moved, a $600,000 piece of evidence displayed in front of people praising Preston's financial discipline. I lifted the accounting statement and read it slowly. Beatrice expected outrage. Instead, I asked whether the figures had been prepared by Preston's corporate accounting department. The question made him glance at Vanessa before answering that his mother had compiled the document herself. I nodded as though impressed, and asked whether he was comfortable having everyone present rely on its accuracy. His smile tightened, but he said yes. That answer was all I needed. Beatrice had accidentally created another witness list for the false image Preston was maintaining. Everyone at the table had now heard him endorse a financial narrative that could later be compared against the company's collapsing accounts. I placed the document back on the table without touching the pen. In a quiet voice, I explained that my divorce attorney had instructed me not to sign informal financial statements outside the formal disclosure process. Beatrice accused me of hiding behind legal technicalities. I apologized for disappointing her and said I would be happy to preserve a copy for my attorney's review. Her face hardened. She had expected me either to sign away my dignity or create a public scene. My calm refusal denied her both outcomes. I stood and carefully folded my copy of the false accounting into my handbag. Then I turned toward Vanessa and complimented her necklace. I said it looked exactly like the kind of item a successful logistics company might classify as a promotional expense. Vanessa's smile flickered. Preston's hand stopped halfway to his wine glass. I thanked Beatrice for gathering so many witnesses and told the room that the evening had been unexpectedly useful. Before anyone could ask what I meant, I turned and walked out of the dining room. The crisp night air felt clean after the suffocating atmosphere inside. I crossed the driveway without looking back and slid into my car. Behind the mansion's illuminated windows, their silhouettes remained gathered around the table, still trying to convince one another that they controlled the story. They had not humiliated me. They had handed me a signed document, a room full of witnesses, and another piece of evidence proving how completely Preston believed his own lies. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, my phone began to ring through the car speakers. It was Harrison. He did not bother with a greeting. His voice was sharp and laced with professional anticipation. He told me he had been monitoring the banking portals all evening, waiting for the deadline to pass. The 30-day grace period on the high-interest commercial loan officially expired at midnight. Preston failed to make the required quarterly payment. The logistics company was now in formal default. Since Apex Holdings purchased the majority of the distressed debt earlier that week, the collateral contract was now entirely in my hands. Harrison asked me for my final directive. I looked out the windshield at the massive stone mansion looming in the dark, knowing Beatrice was inside, celebrating her cruel little victory. I leaned back against the leather headrest and took a slow, deliberate breath. I told Harrison to authorize the silent foreclosure immediately. I instructed him to file the paperwork with the county clerk at dawn and ensure there were no extensions, no warnings, and absolutely no mercy. The house was not legally mine yet, but for the first time its fate rested entirely in my hands. If the filing survived the final review, Beatrice would lose the estate before she even realized the process had begun. I placed my phone onto the passenger seat and shifted my car into drive. The tires crunched softly against the loose gravel at the edge of the road as I pulled away from the sprawling estate. The darkness of the tree-lined street felt comforting, wrapping around my vehicle like a protective shield. I drove back to my small rented apartment with a profound sense of clarity. The pieces of my elaborate puzzle were finally locking together, forming a trap so perfectly constructed that Preston would never see it coming until the steel jaws snapped completely shut. Over the next several weeks, Harrison and my legal team moved with surgical precision. They quietly laid the complex legal groundwork for the silent foreclosure on the Connecticut property. The laws regarding commercial loan defaults were incredibly rigid, but they required meticulous administrative filing to ensure Beatrice received absolutely no preliminary warnings. My attorneys utilized a series of specialized corporate loopholes attached to the original predatory loan Preston had signed. Because the loan was structured under a commercial entity rather than a standard residential mortgage, we bypassed the usual 90-day residential notice requirements. Harrison ensured that the county clerk sealed the transfer of the deed pending the final execution date. Beatrice continued to host her lavish afternoon teas and bridge club meetings, completely unaware that she was entertaining her wealthy friends inside a house she no longer legally owned. While the real estate trap was being set, my focus remained heavily on the logistics company. Apex Holdings now officially owned exactly 60% of the corporate debt. I was Preston's absolute master, on paper holding the majority of his financial liabilities in my very own hands. I controlled his credit lines, I controlled his operational liquidity, and I controlled the underlying capital that kept his trucks on the road. Yet Preston remained blissfully clueless about the true identity of his new corporate overlord. In fact, he viewed the sudden buyout of his distressed debt as a massive personal victory. Through the cloned database, I monitored his internal communications. He sent arrogant emails to his executive board bragging about his exceptional business acumen. He genuinely believed he had charmed a massive passive investment firm into saving his family legacy. He told his board members that the new lenient creditor simply recognized his brilliant vision for the company's future. He assumed Apex Holdings was a faceless conglomerate that would sit back and collect modest interest payments without ever looking closely at his daily operational ledgers. His dangerous overconfidence fueled a catastrophic escalation in his spending. Believing he had successfully dodged a financial bullet, Preston began funneling even more corporate capital directly into his personal lifestyle. I sat at my small kitchen table every single night, watching the live feed of the company credit cards. The data poured across my screen, painting a vivid picture of a man utterly detached from reality. He booked a spontaneous luxury vacation for himself and Vanessa to the Amalfi Coast. I watched the transactions process in real time. First-class plane tickets followed by a $10,000 charge for a private villa overlooking the ocean. He billed the entire trip to the logistics company as an international vendor networking expedition. There were no international vendors in Italy. There was only Vanessa sipping expensive champagne on a sun-drenched balcony, while the mechanics back at the company warehouse were being told their overtime pay was temporarily suspended due to budget constraints. He purchased her a vintage sports car, charging the massive down payment to the corporate transportation expansion fund. He paid for her regular spa treatments, exclusive designer wardrobes, and lavish dinners at five-star restaurants using the operational expense accounts. I meticulously tracked every single embezzled dollar. I did not just look at the numbers, I cross-referenced them. I matched the fraudulent expense reports against the flight manifest, the hotel bookings, and the digital receipts. I compiled a bulletproof criminal dossier, mapping out exactly how Preston was systematically bleeding his own family company dry to finance his illicit affair. I created heavily encrypted backups of every forged invoice and every false financial statement he submitted to the board of directors. I was building a cage of evidence so strong that no corporate lawyer in the country would ever be able to dismantle it. Watching them dig their own graves was an exercise in extreme emotional discipline. There were moments when the sheer audacity of his betrayal threatened to break through my carefully maintained composure. I would see a charge for a romantic dinner at the exact restaurant where we had celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, and my chest would tighten with a sudden sharp ache. But I refused to let the pain consume me. I channeled every ounce of that hurt into my strategy. I reminded myself that the man I had loved was an illusion. The man spending stolen corporate funds on his mistress was the reality. I was not mourning a marriage anymore. I was executing a hostile takeover of my own life. As the weeks passed, the weather outside turned bitterly cold, signaling the final stretch of my carefully orchestrated plan. I continued to play the part of the broken, desperate wife whenever I had to interact with his legal team. I responded to their aggressive emails with polite, timid requests for small concessions. I made sure they believed I was spending my days weeping in a cheap apartment, terrified of the impending poverty they had promised me. My performance kept them completely off guard. They stopped looking for hidden traps because they were entirely convinced I possessed no weapons to fight back. Then the notification I had been waiting for finally arrived. My modest divorce attorney David called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was laced with deep sympathy as he informed me that the final divorce mediation had been officially scheduled for the end of the week. He told me Preston's lawyers were pushing for a rapid conclusion, and they were not willing to budge on the pathetic $20,000 settlement offer. David gently advised me that we had run out of options, and that I should prepare myself to sign the paperwork and walk away with nothing. I thanked David for his hard work, keeping my voice sufficiently shaky and vulnerable. I told him I understood the reality of my situation and that I was ready to surrender. I hung up the phone and walked over to my desk. I opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Inside the envelope was a specifically drafted set of documents I had spent weeks perfecting with Harrison and his elite team of corporate litigators. The envelope did not reveal its purpose from the outside. Harrison's lawyers had prepared a final packet that matched the formatting of the routine disclosure documents expected at mediation, but they refused to explain the decisive page to me over ordinary channels. David alone carried the insertion copy sealed beneath the rest of his working papers. My role was simpler and harder. Keep Preston impatient, certain of victory, and unwilling to slow the process down. If he read every page carefully, the plan would stop. If he behaved exactly as he had throughout our marriage, he would create the legal opening himself. I locked the envelope inside my briefcase, checked the time, and left for the final mediation, knowing the trap depended not on deception, but on Preston's refusal to respect anything he believed was beneath him. The rainy drive to the busy downtown legal district took less than 40 minutes, but I used every single second of that stressful commute to perfectly calibrate my physical performance. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Preston's elite legal team. I took a final look in the rearview mirror. I had worn a faded, oversized gray sweater and pulled my hair back into a messy low ponytail. I applied a very faint layer of pale powder under my eyes to make myself look deeply exhausted and completely drained of all life. I practiced a slight tremor in my hands, letting my shoulders round forward into a posture of absolute defeat. When I stepped out of the elevator onto the 50th floor, my discount attorney, David, was already waiting for me in the lobby. He looked incredibly nervous, clutching a thin manila folder against his chest. He offered a sympathetic smile and whispered that we just needed to get through today. I gave him a weak, fragile nod, pretending I was barely holding myself together. The receptionist escorted us down a cherry wood hallway into the primary mediation suite. The massive, imposing room was designed specifically to make anyone sitting on the opposing side of the long table feel incredibly small. Preston was already seated at the center of the glass conference table. He wore a charcoal suit, radiating the arrogant energy of a predator who had cornered his prey. Beside him was his lead corporate attorney, a man known for ruthless courtroom tactics and zero empathy. But what truly captured my attention was the person sitting in the plush visitor chairs at the far corner. It was Vanessa. She had no legal reason to be present at a confidential divorce mediation, but Preston had brought her to inflict maximum emotional damage. She was wearing a tailored designer dress, and resting beautifully against her collarbone was the exact teardrop diamond necklace Preston had purchased using stolen corporate funds. She caught my eye and offered a triumphant smile before looking down at her phone. Her thumbs moved quickly, and a second later Preston's phone chimed. He glanced at his screen and smiled back at her. They were texting each other heart emojis, openly mocking my presence. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, keeping my eyes lowered to the polished glass table. The court-appointed mediator, a soft-spoken woman with kind eyes, sat at the head of the table and attempted to open the session with a standard statement about finding a mutually respectful resolution. Preston's lead attorney did not let her finish her sentence. He leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and launched immediately into a calculated, brutal verbal assault. He stated clearly for the official record that his very generous client was offering a final non-negotiable settlement of exactly $20,000. He then slid a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents across the table, stopping just inches from my folded hands. The attorney aggressively listed their unyielding demands. I was to permanently relinquish all claims to the logistics company. I was to absolutely sign away any marital rights to the sprawling Connecticut estate. I was to waive all future rights to spousal support, alimony, or profit sharing. The attorney stared directly at me with cold, dead eyes and told me that if I refused to accept these generous terms, they would immediately file a motion to drag the proceedings into a prolonged litigation phase. He promised they would bury me under mountains of legal discovery and force me to pay their exorbitant attorney fees, which would instantly bankrupt me completely. David tried to speak up, clearing his throat nervously and suggesting that $20,000 was highly irregular for a marriage that had lasted this long. Preston's attorney immediately barked at him, shutting David down with a barrage of complex legal jargon and thinly veiled threats about reporting David to the state bar for frivolous litigation. David shrank back into his chair, completely outmatched and thoroughly intimidated. This was exactly what I needed to happen. I needed Preston to feel entirely unchallenged. I began to execute my physical performance with absolute precision. I let my breathing become shallow and rapid. I unclasped my hands and allowed a visible tremor to take over my fingers as I reached out to touch the edge of the settlement binder. I kept my head bowed low, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face as I squeezed my eyes shut to force a fresh wave of tears to the surface. I let out a small, pathetic gasp, making sure it was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Preston leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms behind his head. He looked over at Vanessa, who was quietly giggling behind her hand. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the sound of my manufactured crying. I picked up the first page of the settlement, my hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled in the quiet air. I read through the draconian terms, feeling the heavy gaze of the men sitting across from me. They were absolutely enjoying my display of utter misery. Preston spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me I had brought this entire situation upon myself by being an ungrateful and unsupportive partner. He said he was tired of carrying the financial burden of my dead weight, and that this settlement was my only ticket out of complete destitution. He told me to stop dragging out the inevitable and just accept the reality of my failure. The mediator shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the sheer cruelty of the situation. She looked at Preston with a deep frown before turning her kind eyes toward me. She leaned across the table and spoke in a gentle, reassuring voice. She told me I was under no legal obligation to sign anything in this room today. She advised me that the terms they were demanding were exceptionally harsh and highly unusual for a standard dissolution of marriage. She reminded me that mediation was a voluntary process, and if I felt overly pressured or coerced, we could suspend the session immediately and reconvene when I had secured more aggressive representation. She placed a comforting hand over my trembling fingers and softly promised me that I did not have to accept such a terrible deal just because I felt intimidated by their aggressive tactics. Preston glared at the mediator, his face flushing with sudden hot anger at her interference. He slammed his hand against the glass table, causing David to jump in his seat. He leaned forward, his eyes dark and threatening. He demanded we wrap this up right now, refusing to waste another minute of his time on a woman who meant nothing to him. I slowly lifted my head, letting the fake tears brim over my eyelashes and slide down my pale cheeks. I looked directly at the mediator and then shifted my gaze to Preston. I let out a ragged, exhausted sigh, making sure my voice sounded entirely broken. I stated quietly that I did not want to fight anymore, and that I just wanted it all to be over right now. Preston smiled a cold, predatory smile. He slid the final settlement page and a heavy silver pen directly across the glass table, demanding I sign away my life. I stared at the heavy silver pen resting on the cool glass table, taking a long, shaky breath that sounded like absolute surrender. The cold metal felt heavy against my trembling fingers as I carefully picked it up. I looked down at the final settlement page resting before me. The crisp, black text outlined my complete and total defeat. By signing this specific document, I was officially agreeing to accept the pathetic sum of $20,000. I was legally waiving any right to future spousal support. I was abandoning all claims to the sprawling Connecticut estate and relinquishing any potential marital interest in the family logistics company. To anyone else in the room, it looked like I was throwing away my entire future. To me, it was the final necessary sacrifice to trigger the trap I had spent weeks carefully constructing in the shadows. I let the tip of the pen hover over the dotted line. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing one final perfectly timed tear to slip free. The single drop of salt water splashed directly onto the bottom corner of the crisp white page. I heard Vanessa let out a soft, muffled giggle from her seat in the gallery, clearly amused by my display of absolute misery. Preston tapped his fingers impatiently against the table, urging me to just get it over with so he could leave. I pressed the pen to the paper and slowly signed my name. The exact moment the ink dried, Preston let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and actually clapped his hands together as if he had just won a grueling championship match. His lead corporate attorney offered a tight, professional smile and immediately began organizing the massive stacks of duplicate copies, financial disclosures, and standard liability waivers that required both of our signatures to finalize the dissolution. This was the tedious administrative phase of the mediation. It was boring and involved passing dozens of thick legal documents back and forth across the table. It was also the exact moment my strategy shifted from defense to relentless offense. David, my supposedly incompetent discount lawyer, opened his thin manila folder. He had played the part of the overwhelmed, outmatched public defender flawlessly all afternoon. He had stuttered, backed down from arguments, and allowed Preston's legal team to bully him into submission. But David was not actually incompetent. He was a highly specialized contract attorney Harrison had quietly retained specifically for this exact 10-second window of opportunity. As Preston's lawyer slid a towering stack of addendums across the glass table, David clumsily dropped his folder. A flurry of papers spilled out, spreading across our side of the table in total disarray. David muttered a frantic apology, gathering the scattered sheets with shaking hands. Preston rolled his eyes and muttered a harsh insult about David being an absolute amateur who had no business practicing law. The mediator tried to help sort the pages, but David quickly restacked them himself. During that intentional momentary chaos, David seamlessly executed the maneuver we had practiced for hours. He took a uniquely drafted document from the bottom of his pile and smoothly slipped it directly into the exact center of Preston's towering stack of signature pages. The hidden document was a masterpiece of sophisticated legal camouflage. Harrison and his elite team of corporate litigators had spent days drafting it to ensure it looked identical to a standard marital financial disclosure form. It featured the same boilerplate formatting, the same font, and the same dense legal jargon that populated the rest of the divorce paperwork. But it was not a family law document. It was a formal creditor acknowledgement and corporate restructuring waiver. The dense paragraphs explicitly stated that the signatory acknowledged their primary corporate entity was in severe default to its largest majority debt holder. More importantly, it contained a binding, unappealable clause, waiving the signatory's right to contest any future hostile restructuring, liquidation, or executive termination initiated by that specific holding company. David neatly tapped the stack of papers against the table to align the edges and pushed them respectfully toward Preston's side of the glass. He told Preston's attorney that these were the final mutual disclosure acknowledgments that required his client's immediate initials and signature. The lead corporate attorney took the stack and began to meticulously flip through the pages. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my posture slumped and my eyes focused securely on my lap. If his lawyer read the document carefully, he would instantly recognize the corporate jargon and halt the entire mediation. The trap would be exposed, and my leverage would vanish. But I had counted heavily on Preston's fundamental character flaws. I was banking entirely on his arrogance, his profound impatience, and his desperate need to go celebrate his hollow victory with his mistress. Preston checked his heavy gold watch and let out a loud groan of frustration. He looked over at Vanessa, who was pouting slightly and checking her own phone, clearly bored with the tedious administrative process. Preston turned to his attorney and snatched the stack of papers directly out of the older man's hands. He demanded to know how many more pages he had to sign before he could finally leave this miserable room. His lead attorney looked slightly alarmed by the sudden aggressive movement. He placed a calming hand on Preston's arm and strongly advised his client to slow down. He told Preston it was standard legal protocol to verify every single page and read the fine print before putting his pen to any binding agreement, regardless of how tedious it seemed. Preston scoffed loudly, pulling his arm away from his lawyer with a look of pure disgust. He arrogantly declared that he did not need to waste another hour reading boilerplate garbage because they had already won the negotiation outright. He reminded his attorney that they had just successfully bullied me into accepting a pathetic $20,000 and stripping away all my marital rights. He stated that the war was officially over, and he was not going to sit in this stuffy conference room for another second while a discount lawyer shuffled pointless paperwork around. The mediator attempted to intervene gently, reminding Preston that it was always in his best interest to review the documents fully before authorizing them. Preston glared at her, telling her to mind her own business and just point to where he needed to sign so he could get out of here and get on with his fabulous life. He grabbed his heavy silver pen and began flipping rapidly through the stack of papers. He did not read a single sentence. He just looked for the small, yellow sticky notes David had conveniently placed on the signature lines. He initialed the first page. He initialed the second page. He signed the standard liability waiver with a flourish. I held my breath, completely stilling my body, as his fingers flipped the page to the Trojan horse document. The bold legal text regarding corporate restructuring was sitting right there in plain sight. Any competent business executive would have spotted the words debt holder and restructuring immediately upon glancing at the page. But Preston was completely blinded by his own towering ego and his rush to go drink expensive champagne with Vanessa. He saw the yellow sticky note placed perfectly at the bottom of the page. He did not even pause to glance at the heading or the dense paragraphs above it. Preston pressed his pen to the paper and signed his name on the dotted line. By executing that single careless signature, he legally acknowledged his logistics company was entirely at the mercy of its largest creditor. He officially surrendered his right to appeal any corporate takeover. He unknowingly handed complete and absolute control of his entire family empire directly over to Apex Holdings. The final piece of my intricate trap snapped permanently shut, securing my ultimate victory without any resistance. I allowed myself a very small, hidden smile as the ink dried on the final page. It was finally done. The mediator collected the signed settlement pages and instructed both legal teams to remain available until the copies were certified. Preston rose before she finished speaking. He took Vanessa by the arm and walked out without looking back, already discussing where they would celebrate. His attorney remained behind, studying the disordered stack with a faint uneasiness he could not yet explain. David and I waited until the clerk stamped our copies. In the elevator, he said nothing. Only when we reached the parking garage did he open his briefcase and show me Preston's signature beneath the creditor acknowledgement. The page was intact, witnessed, and part of the final executed packet. I called Harrison from the car. He confirmed that the county clerk had recorded the deed transfer at noon and that the emergency board notices were ready. The legal pieces were finally aligned. I placed the certified documents inside my briefcase, started the engine, and pulled out of the garage. The drive from downtown to the Connecticut estate took just over an hour. The autumn foliage was in full display, painting the highway in brilliant shades of amber and gold. I drove the speed limit, enjoying the scenery and listening to the steady hum of my tires against the pavement. Harrison had already confirmed that the final deed transfer had been officially recorded by the county clerk at precisely noon. The property legally belonged to Apex Holdings, which meant it belonged to me. I had the official documentation resting safely inside my leather briefcase. When I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates, the sprawling stone mansion looked magnificent against the gray sky. It was no longer a monument to Beatrice. It was my house. I parked my sedan near the grand front entrance and stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. The air up here was crisper, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I walked up the wide brick steps and used my original brass key to unlock the heavy oak door. The entryway was completely silent. The housekeeper usually took Friday afternoons off, meaning the massive house was entirely empty. I walked slowly through the ground floor, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble. I ran my fingers over the expensive mahogany side tables and the velvet backs of the antique chairs. Beatrice spent decades curating this space to intimidate guests. I walked into the formal living room and sat down quietly. I placed my leather briefcase on the glass coffee table and waited patiently for them to arrive. I knew exactly how long it would take Preston to finish his drinks, collect Vanessa, and drive his mother back to witness my eviction. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the minutes with a heavy rhythmic sound. The afternoon sun began to lower behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the plush Persian rugs. Exactly 45 minutes later, I heard the roar of Preston's sports car pulling up the driveway. Car doors slammed shut, followed by high heels clicking rapidly up the brick steps. The front door swung open with a loud thud, and Preston's voice immediately echoed through the grand foyer, shouting my name. He demanded to know why my car was parked outside and ordered me to drag my garbage out to the curb immediately. I remained silent in the wing chair, listening as their footsteps approached the living room. Beatrice entered first, clutching her designer handbag with Preston and Vanessa trailing closely behind her. When Beatrice saw me sitting in her sacred chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. She demanded I stand up, screaming that my presence was defiling her home. Vanessa stood behind Preston, crossing her arms and offering a pathetic sneer. Preston marched forward, his face flushed with anger, and told me my eviction was no longer scheduled for sunset. He declared I had exactly 5 minutes to leave. Now. I did not move a single muscle. I looked at Beatrice, then at Preston, and finally at Vanessa, maintaining a soft, serene expression. I reached forward and calmly unclasped the brass buckles of my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents bearing the official seal of the county clerk. I placed the papers neatly on the glass coffee table, making sure the bold heading was clearly visible. Preston scoffed, demanding to know what kind of desperate stunt I was pulling. He told me whatever fake papers I printed out would not save me from the reality of my defeat. I leaned back into the velvet chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands. I spoke with a steady, clear voice. Preston let out a harsh, barking laugh, looking at his mother to share the joke. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she glared down at the documents on the table. I told them the 30-day grace period on the commercial collateral loan tied to this property expired earlier this week. I watched Preston's face carefully as the words registered. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, waving his hand dismissively. He aggressively stated he successfully renegotiated that debt with the new holding company, and his corporate restructuring waiver protected all family assets. I nodded slowly, praising his memory of the documents he signed hours ago in mediation. I gently suggested he look extremely closely at them. Beatrice snatched the documents off the table, pulling reading glasses from her designer purse with shaking hands. She flipped past the cover page, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. The room went dead silent as she read the final transfer of deed. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking old and incredibly fragile. Her hands began to tremble so violently, the papers rattled loudly in the quiet room. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Preston grabbed the papers from his mother's hands, his eyes darting frantically across the page. He read the corporate ownership structure, the default execution, and the final signature. His face turned a deep purple as reality crashed upon him. He looked at me with wild, panicked eyes, demanding to know how this was mathematically possible. He screamed, I was completely broke, that I walked away with a miserable $20,000 settlement, and there was no way I could afford to buy out his corporate debt. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I told him he severely underestimated my financial literacy and profoundly overestimated his own intelligence. I explained I had tracked every dollar he embezzled from the logistics firm to fund his lavish vacations and purchase diamond necklaces for his mistress. I pointed directly at the stunning jewelry resting against Vanessa's collarbone. I told him I used that encrypted data to legally force creditors to sell me the debt. Beatrice let out a high, thin gasp, clutching her chest as she sank onto the velvet sofa. Vanessa instinctively reached up to cover the diamond necklace with her hand, her eyes darting nervously toward the front door. Preston stood completely paralyzed, the official foreclosure documents slipping from his fingers and scattering across the Persian rug. He handed me the entire family empire with a single careless signature, and now he had absolutely nothing left. I walked around the glass coffee table, stepping directly over the scattered papers. I stopped right in front of Preston, looking deep into his terrified eyes. I told him to go pack whatever pathetic belongings he could carry. Get out of my house immediately before I call the local police. Now. Preston stood frozen in the center of the Persian rug, the color completely drained from his face as the crushing reality of his profound failure washed over him. The heavy silence was absolute, but Beatrice was fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat. Her entire existence was built on unearned privilege. She pulled herself up from the velvet sofa, her hands visibly shaking, but her jaw set in a rigid line of stubborn denial. She marched over to the scattered foreclosure documents, kicking them aside. She demanded that Vanessa follow her into the grand foyer, where they had dropped a heavy box of thick black garbage bags upon arriving. They had brought them specifically to pack up whatever remnants of my life were still upstairs. Beatrice grabbed a fistful of plastic bags and threw them violently onto the imported marble floor. I walked slowly out of the formal living room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone tiles as I followed them. Preston trailed blindly behind us like a completely broken man, his shoulders slumped forward and his dark eyes entirely vacant. Beatrice stood defiantly by the heavy oak front door, her chest heaving rapidly with manufactured righteous indignation. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her harsh voice escalating into a piercing shriek that loudly echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. She screamed that the official documents were obvious forgeries, a desperate stunt cooked up by a jealous, discarded woman. She yelled that I was absolutely nothing but a low-class gold digger who had failed to secure the family bag, and now I was throwing a childish temper tantrum because I had definitively lost. She kicked the garbage bags toward my feet, demanding I immediately crawl upstairs, pack my cheap clothes, and get out of her sight forever. "Don't ever set foot in my house again!" she shrieked, her face turning an unhealthy shade of dark crimson. "Get out!" I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in response. I simply stood motionless under the massive crystal chandelier, feeling the absolute power of the long-awaited moment settle over my tense shoulders like a heavy, comforting cloak. I looked calmly at the terrible woman who had made my daily life a living nightmare for years, who had constantly belittled my intelligence and openly mocked my career aspirations. I let a long, heavy silence slowly stretch through the grand foyer, forcing her to endure the incredibly uncomfortable quiet. I smoothed the front of my faded gray sweater, locking my cold eyes directly onto hers. "Actually, Beatrice," I said, my steady voice carrying a soft, lethal calm that made Vanessa take a nervous step backward. "I already sold this house, and your son is about to lose the only title he has left." The words hung in the crisp evening air, carrying the absolute weight of a finalized execution. For a brief split second, total suffocating silence descended upon the grand foyer once again. Then Beatrice violently threw her head back and erupted into a sudden wild fit of high-pitched hysterical laughter. It was a terrible grating sound, entirely devoid of any genuine humor. She aggressively clutched her expensive pearl necklace, laughing so incredibly hard that tears actually began to form in the corners of her wrinkled eyes. She looked over at Vanessa, who was nervously forcing a weak, uncertain smile, and then quickly turned her mocking gaze back to my face. She harshly wiped a stray tear from her pale cheek, her loud laughter slowly subsiding into a cruel, condescending sneer. She bluntly asked me if I was actually delusional enough to genuinely believe the ridiculous words coming out of my own mouth. She aggressively demanded to know exactly how a pathetic freelance nobody working from a cheap rented apartment could ever possibly possess the vast financial capital required to execute a hostile takeover of an established logistics empire. She stated that I was clearly mentally unwell and that my revenge fantasy was officially over. Preston finally found his failing voice, stepping forward weakly and reaching out to touch his arrogant mother's stiff arm. He desperately tried to speak, tried to tell her that the signatures were completely real and that the holding company was a legitimate corporate entity. But Beatrice violently swatted his shaking hand away in pure disgust. She was entirely lost within her own arrogant alternate reality, stubbornly refusing to let any concrete facts penetrate the thick armor of her massive, fragile ego. She angrily marched over to the antique console table, sitting against the hallway wall, and snatched up the heavy landline telephone. She held the plastic receiver up like a dangerous weapon, her dark eyes blazing with furious intent. She loudly told me I had exactly 1 minute to grab my garbage bags and walk out the front door before she dialed emergency services. She aggressively threatened to call the police department and have me physically dragged off the private family property for criminal trespassing, promising to press the maximum legal charges available to ensure I spent the long night freezing inside a cold municipal jail cell. I simply maintained my calm, serene posture, purposefully, keeping my steady hands lightly clasped together resting right in front of me. I quietly watched her tense index finger hover aggressively over the telephone keypad, patiently waiting for me to suddenly break. Waiting for the exact familiar timid submission she had conditioned me to display for so many painful years. Vanessa proudly crossed her arms tightly, a deeply smug, triumphant little smile returning to her perfectly contoured face. They both genuinely believed they still securely held all the winning cards today. They were so thoroughly accustomed to always winning through sheer aggressive intimidation that they simply could not recognize when they had already been completely permanently dismantled. The absolute blinding depth of their vast unearned privilege was truly staggering to silently witness. I let out a soft, relaxed breath, completely unbothered by the heavy plastic receiver still shaking slightly in my former mother-in-law's meticulously manicured hand. I calmly turned my head slightly, looking toward the heavy solid oak front door, quietly listening to the distinct outside sounds now coming directly from the long cobblestone driveway. The loud crunching of vehicle tires scraping against the loose gravel had abruptly stopped several moments ago, replaced by the distinct loud sound of heavy car doors slamming forcefully shut in perfect unison. Rapid footsteps suddenly began to approach the massive house, moving quickly with a steady, purposeful, professional rhythm. They were absolutely not the light, hesitant steps of a common delivery driver or a lost, wandering neighbor looking for directions. They were distinctly heavy, authoritative footfalls, heavy black boots striking the brick steps of the grand front porch with undeniable, serious intent. The metallic jingle of heavy utility belts and bulky radios accompanied the heavy steps echoing clearly through the thick wooden door. Beatrice paused, the plastic phone still hovering near her ear, her manicured brow furrowing in deep confusion. Vanessa uncrossed her arms, her smug expression melting into a look of sudden, profound apprehension. Preston let out a low, pathetic whimper, backing quickly away from the front door and sinking onto the bottom step of the grand, sweeping staircase. I looked back at Beatrice, allowing a slow, genuine smile to spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had meticulously calculated every single variable of her survival. I looked her dead in the eye. "I saved you the trouble. The police are already here." The heavy oak door swung open before Beatrice could even finish, gasping in shock. Two uniformed deputies stepped inside the grand foyer, bringing a rush of cold autumn air with them. They were flanked by the county sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick gray mustache and a weary expression. His heavy boots thudded against the imported Italian marble. He stopped a few feet away from our frozen tableau and unhooked a clipboard from his heavy leather utility belt. Beatrice dropped the plastic telephone receiver. She quickly adjusted her pearl necklace, pulling herself up to her full height to project the arrogant authority she had weaponized for decades. She plastered on a fake, overly polite smile and stepped toward the officers. She immediately began speaking in her sweetest, most condescending tone, thanking the sheriff for arriving so quickly to remove the trespassing vagrant from her property. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest and demanded they place me in handcuffs. The sheriff did not even look at me. He looked at the official paperwork clipped to his board, verified the address at the top of the page, and then looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. He asked if she was Beatrice Kensington, the primary resident of the estate. Beatrice puffed out her chest and confirmed her identity with a proud, haughty nod. Instead of reaching for his handcuffs, the sheriff pulled a thick, folded stack of papers from his jacket pocket and extended his hand. He stated in a loud, clear, professional voice that he was serving her with an official court-ordered notice of immediate eviction. He explained that the property had been legally foreclosed upon and successfully transferred to a new owner. He informed her that she and all other occupants had exactly 1 hour to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they would be physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. Beatrice stared at the papers in the sheriff's outstretched hand, as if he were holding a live, venomous snake. She refused to take them. Her fake smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She stammered that this was completely impossible, claiming her family had owned the estate for 4 generations, and there was absolutely no mortgage on the property. She looked frantically at Preston, demanding he tell the officers there had been a terrible administrative mistake. Preston could not speak. He was trembling violently, his eyes darting wildly between the sheriff, his mother, and the floor. He looked like a cornered animal. I calmly walked over, took the eviction notice from the sheriff's hand, and held it up so Beatrice could see the bold black text. I kept my voice smooth, steady, and perfectly pleasant. I stepped beside the sheriff and opened my briefcase. Rather than repeat the history of Preston's loans, I removed 3 certified documents and placed them on the antique console table: the recorded deed, transfer the court-validated eviction order, and the executed sale agreement with the commercial developer. Each page carried an official seal and a verification number. Preston lunged toward the papers, but one of the deputies moved between us. The sheriff told him that any challenge would have to be filed through the court and that the eviction remained enforceable unless a judge suspended it. Preston demanded to call his attorney. The sheriff calmly said he was free to make that call after he gathered his belongings and stepped outside. Beatrice ignored him. Her eyes had fixed on the developer's agreement. She read the description of the proposed construction site, the scheduled demolition date, and the clause allowing immediate removal of the existing structures. Her lips moved silently over the words before she looked up at me. She asked whether the sale could be reversed if she paid whatever Preston owed. I told her the transaction had already closed. The developer now controlled the future use of the land, and Apex Holdings had no remaining authority to preserve the estate. This was no longer a temporary refinancing dispute that her family name could make disappear. The house gardens, ballroom, library, and stone facade had already passed beyond her reach. The sheriff's presence did not create that reality. It merely enforced it. Beatrice gripped the edge of the console table and asked what I expected to gain by destroying a home that had belonged to her family for generations. Nothing from the house, I said. The value was in ending the illusion that your family could take anything from anyone without consequence. Then I pointed to the developer's signature at the bottom of the page and told her that demolition crews were scheduled to begin the following month. The absolute finality of my words shattered the last remaining pieces of Beatrice's fragile reality. Her entire identity was tied to this house, to the prestige and power it represented in their elite social circles. Hearing that it was going to be demolished and paved over was a fate worse than death. She turned toward Preston. The terrifying rage radiating from her body was palpable. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. Preston backed away, holding his hands up in a pathetic, defensive gesture. He stammered a weak apology, claiming he thought he could outsmart the market and pay the loans back before anyone noticed the missing funds. He whined that he was just trying to grow the family empire. Beatrice did not say a word. She closed the distance between them in 3 rapid steps and struck him. She slapped Preston directly across the face with such incredible force that the sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly through the high, vaulted foyer. Preston stumbled backward, crying out in pain and clutching his reddening cheek. He crashed into the bottom banister of the sweeping staircase, looking up at his mother with wide tears in his eyes. Beatrice screamed at him, her voice cracking with rage, cursing him for gambling away her ancestral home and destroying their family legacy. She called him a pathetic failure. Vanessa, who had been standing frozen in shock near the front door, suddenly rushed forward. She wrapped her arms protectively around Preston's trembling shoulders, pulling him against her chest. She glared fiercely at Beatrice and then shot me a look of pure, concentrated hatred. She smoothed Preston's expensive suit jacket and began speaking to him in a loud, soothing voice, desperately trying to calm his hyperventilating panic. She told him to ignore his mother and to ignore me. She stroked his hair and cooed that everything was going to be perfectly fine. She confidently stated that it did not matter if they lost this dusty old house, because he was still a brilliant CEO. She promised him that he still had the massive logistics company, his massive salary, and his corporate expense accounts. She kissed his cheek and loudly declared that they would just buy a brand new, much better house together, far away from all this miserable family drama. I stood quietly near the sheriff, listening to her desperate, delusional pep talk. I calmly smoothed the sleeve of my faded gray sweater and looked down at my wrist. I checked the time on my simple silver watch, noting the exact position of the hands. I looked up, meeting Preston's tear-filled eyes, and offered him one last razor-sharp smile. I warned him that he might want to rethink his real estate plans, considering he had a mandatory emergency board meeting in exactly 20 minutes. The horror of my statement took 10 seconds to penetrate Preston's mind. He stood paralyzed near the bottom of the staircase, while the sheriff and deputies watched with professional indifference. His suit was wrinkled, and a red handprint was swelling across his cheek where his mother had struck him. He looked down at his gold watch, and his dark eyes widened as the hands confirmed the exact time. The emergency board meeting was not a bluff. The crushing realization that he was about to lose his corporate empire finally snapped him out of his paralysis. He let out a strange sound, caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. He lunged forward, grabbing Vanessa by the wrist with such desperate force that she stumbled over her high heels. He did not bother retrieving the scattered foreclosure documents from the marble floor. He simply yelled at his mother to get moving right this second if she ever wanted to see a single dime of her allowance again. Beatrice let out an indignant shriek, but the terror radiating from her son compelled her to obey. She ran toward the heavy oak front door, her designer handbag swinging wildly as she scrambled to keep up with his frantic pace. I remained perfectly still, watching them flee exactly as I had orchestrated. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. Outside, the screech of tires against the cobblestone driveway pierced the quiet afternoon air. Preston had abandoned any pretense of control. He shoved Vanessa into the passenger seat of his sports car and threw his mother into the cramped back seat before diving behind the steering wheel. The engine roared to life with a deafening growl. He did not bother reversing carefully down the long path. He threw the transmission into gear and slammed his shoe onto the accelerator. The rear tires spun wildly, tearing deep gashes into Beatrice's manicured lawn before finding traction on the asphalt. The car fishtailed dangerously as it shot out of the iron gates and merged aggressively onto the main road. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Preston gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. Cold sweat beaded across his forehead and dripped down the side of his face, soaking into his starched collar. He was breathing in short, erratic gasps, his chest heaving as he pushed the car past the legal speed limit. He swerved around a delivery truck, ignoring the solid double lines and the blaring horn of an oncoming sedan. Vanessa clutched the dashboard, her face pale with genuine terror, begging him to slow down before he killed them all. Preston completely ignored her desperate pleas. He blew straight through a solid red light at a busy intersection, the loud squeal of his tires masking the terrified gasps from the back seat. Beatrice was clutching the headrest tightly, her earlier rage now replaced by profound fear. She demanded to know what was happening, screaming that he needed to explain how a pathetic housewife had magically stolen her ancestral home. Preston refused to answer her. He reached out with a trembling hand and punched a button on the digital console to activate the Bluetooth speakerphone. He shouted an explicit command, demanding it dial his lead corporate attorney. The phone rang 3 times, filling the cabin with a hollow electronic sound, before the lawyer finally answered. The attorney sounded exhausted, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had just witnessed a massive disaster. Before the man could utter a greeting, Preston began screaming. He ordered his lawyer to file an emergency injunction to halt the fraudulent foreclosure on the estate. He demanded the legal team launch an aggressive lawsuit against Apex Holdings and to have me arrested for corporate espionage and extortion. He was shouting so loudly his voice cracked, echoing sharply against the roof of the speeding car. He yelled that he was the rightful chief executive officer, and he would not allow his company to be stolen by his vindictive ex-wife. A heavy silence stretched over the speakerphone, completely undisturbed except for the aggressive roar of the car engine. When the lead attorney finally spoke, his voice was devoid of its usual warmth. He told Preston in a cold, clinical tone that there would be no emergency injunctions and absolutely no lawsuits. He calmly explained that he had spent the last hour frantically reviewing the specific documents Preston signed during the divorce mediation. The older man stated that David had brilliantly hidden a specialized creditor acknowledgement and corporate restructuring waiver directly inside the standard liability forms. The lawyer's words struck Preston like a physical blow. The attorney explained with brutal precision that by carelessly signing that specific page, Preston had legally surrendered all his executive voting rights directly to Apex Holdings. He had officially admitted the company was in severe unrecoverable default and permanently waived his legal right to contest any hostile takeover initiated by the majority debt holder. The lawyer took a deep breath and delivered the final crushing verdict. He told Preston that the document was ironclad, undeniably binding, and utterly irreversible. He formally advised Preston that he was no longer legally recognized as the chief executive officer of the logistics firm. The attorney then stated he was resigning as Preston's legal counsel effective immediately and disconnected the call, leaving only a dial tone echoing. The sudden silence inside the cabin was completely deafening. Vanessa let out a soft, pathetic whimper, finally comprehending that the man sitting beside her was entirely destitute. Beatrice leaned her head against the cold glass window, her eyes vacant as the reality of her total ruin set in. But Preston violently rejected the truth. His towering, massive ego simply would not allow him to accept that he had been so thoroughly outsmarted. He began muttering to himself, his voice shaking with a manic, desperate energy. He convinced himself that the cowardly lawyer was just an incompetent fool who did not understand corporate loyalty. He declared that the board of directors would never allow a hostile takeover to proceed because he had personally made them all incredibly wealthy. He assured the terrified women in the car that the elite executives sitting in that boardroom owed him their unwavering allegiance and would protect his position at all costs. He slammed his foot harder onto the gas pedal, flying down the highway exit ramp and tearing into the bustling downtown financial district. He whipped the car into the corporate headquarters drop-off zone, ignoring the valet attendants who rushed forward. He left the expensive vehicle running with the doors wide open and sprinted toward the towering glass doors. He burst into the main lobby, his chest heaving, his suit ruined, ignoring the alarmed receptionists as he sprinted directly toward the private executive elevators. The elevator ride up to the 50th floor felt like an eternity. Preston stood rigidly staring at the brass doors, his breathing ragged. When the bell finally chimed, he stormed out, marching down the long carpeted hallway toward the primary executive suite. The administrative staff avoided his wild gaze, completely silent as he passed. He reached the massive double mahogany doors. He raised his foot and aggressively kicked the heavy doors wide open, ready to shout demanding orders to his loyal board of directors. But the words died instantly in his throat. He froze, paralyzed in terror as his frantic eyes locked onto the person sitting calmly in his leather chair. I rested my hands flat on the polished mahogany wood, allowing him a full 10 seconds to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. The executive boardroom was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling downtown financial district. 14 of the most powerful corporate directors in the state sat frozen in their high-backed chairs. They were men and women Preston had always claimed were completely loyal to his family legacy. Right now, not a single one of them would meet his frantic gaze. They stared down at their legal pads or inspected their expensive pens, looking entirely defeated. Standing directly behind my left shoulder was Harrison, projecting the quiet, lethal confidence of a seasoned corporate attorney who knew he had already won the war. Flanking him was a team of 5 ruthless, independent auditors dressed in identical dark suits, holding thick, legal briefcases. I sat perfectly centered at the head of the table, occupying the custom leather chair Preston had specially ordered when he officially took over the company from his father. Preston remained anchored to the carpet just inside the double doors, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and damp with nervous sweat. The bright red handprint from where Beatrice had struck him earlier was still vividly swollen across his left cheek. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a friendly face, searching for someone to stand up and demand that security remove me. When the heavy silence stretched on, uninterrupted, his initial shock quickly morphed into a desperate flailing rage. He took 3 aggressive steps into the room, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He ordered me to get out of his chair immediately. He shouted that this was a private executive meeting and that I was committing corporate trespass. He turned to the senior board members, demanding they call building security and have me physically dragged out into the street. He screamed that I was nothing but a vindictive ex-wife throwing a pathetic temper tantrum because I had lost the divorce settlement. I did not move a single muscle. I simply watched him unravel while the rest of the room remained entirely silent. The senior chairman of the board, a man named Arthur who had known Preston since childhood, finally cleared his throat. Arthur refused to look at Preston, instead keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the polished table. He softly suggested that Preston lower his voice and take a seat. The sheer pity in Arthur's tone hit Preston like a physical blow, causing him to stumble backward. He demanded to know what was going on and why his loyal board was taking orders from a freelance data consultant. I leaned back into the plush leather of his expensive chair, steepling my fingers together. I spoke with a slow, measured cadence that carried effortlessly across the vast expanse of the quiet boardroom. I calmly informed him that his board of directors was not taking orders from his ex-wife. I told him they were currently taking mandatory directives from their new majority stakeholder. Preston let out a harsh barking laugh, shaking his head in aggressive denial. He aggressively stated that his family owned 51% of the corporate voting shares, making a hostile takeover mathematically impossible. He declared that no outside entity possessed the financial capital required to buy out his mother's controlling interest without triggering a mandatory shareholder vote. I nodded slowly, acknowledging his basic understanding of standard corporate law. I then gestured for Harrison to step forward. Harrison unclasped his briefcase and retrieved a single sheet of paper, passing it down the length of the table until it stopped directly in front of Preston. I told Preston to look very closely at the document because he had personally signed it during our divorce mediation earlier that morning. I reminded him about the specialized creditor acknowledgement and the corporate restructuring waiver that his former attorney had frantically tried to warn him about on the car ride over. Preston picked up the paper with trembling hands, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. I explained the absolute reality of his situation with cold, clinical precision. I told him that over the past 4 years, he had secretly leveraged the company's operational assets to secure massive high-risk commercial loans. He had used that hidden capital to fund his lavish lifestyle purchase, expensive gifts for Vanessa, and maintain the illusion of endless family wealth. I informed him that the primary holding company that owned all of that defaulted debt was a private entity called Apex Holdings. I paused, allowing the heavy silence to amplify the absolute finality of my next words. I officially introduced myself to the entire room as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I stated that because he had voluntarily signed the restructuring waiver acknowledging the unrecoverable default, he had legally surrendered all family voting rights directly to my firm to avoid immediate federal bankruptcy. The color drained completely from Preston's face, leaving him looking pale and incredibly sickly. He dropped the paper onto the table as if it had suddenly caught fire. He looked around the room at the 14 silent board members, finally understanding why they had not summoned building security. They had spent the last 2 hours reviewing the financial reality of his catastrophic mismanagement. They knew the company was drowning in toxic debt, and they knew I was the only creditor holding the lifeline. By surrendering his shares, Preston had effectively sold me his entire family empire for the exact price of his own hidden debt. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. The logistics firm, the downtown headquarters, the Connecticut estate, and every single corporate asset now legally belonged to me. He grabbed the back of an empty leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. His voice rose as he insisted that he remained the chief executive officer and could secure emergency financing before the end of the day. He appealed directly to Arthur, reminding him of decades of friendship with the family and promising that the liquidity crisis was temporary. I raised one hand and stopped the speech. "No decision has been announced yet," I said. "You came here demanding the authority of a chief executive officer. The board will now decide whether you still deserve it." The distinction mattered. Apex Holdings controlled the emergency voting rights created by the default, but I wanted the termination recorded through a formal board process after the evidence had been reviewed. Preston would not be able to claim that an angry former spouse had removed him through personal retaliation. 14 directors, independent auditors, and legal counsel would make the decision on the corporate record. I reached into my briefcase and removed the thick-bound dossier. It contained the verified loan schedules, falsified vendor invoices, concealed liabilities, offshore transfers, and personal expenditures charged to operating accounts. I placed both hands on the cover and looked directly at Preston. "Before anyone votes, I said the board is going to see what you did with their company." Then I slid the dossier across the table toward Arthur. The heavy dossier landed directly in front of Arthur with a resounding thud that echoed through the silent boardroom. For a long moment, nobody moved. The 14 executives stared at the thick leather-bound binder as if it were a live explosive device. They had spent decades blindly trusting the arrogant family legacy, and now the complete, absolute, devastating financial reality was sitting right there waiting for them to finally uncover it. I nodded toward Arthur, silently giving him permission to open it. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he flipped back the heavy cover. The very first page was a master summary I had compiled personally, detailing the exact timeline of Preston's catastrophic financial mismanagement. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with absolute authority, projecting my words clearly across the vast room. I instructed the board members to look at the offshore wire transfers highlighted in red ink. I explained that over the past 24 months, Preston had systematically drained the company's emergency reserve accounts. He had completely bypassed the internal accounting department by authorizing emergency operational expenditures that did not actually exist. Arthur flipped the page, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as he looked at the raw data. He was reading the undeniable proof of his golden boy's monumental betrayal. I kept my eyes locked on Preston, who was still standing near the double doors, with Vanessa lingering nervously right behind his shoulder. She had followed him up from the lobby and was now clutching her designer handbag, watching her promised luxurious future evaporate into thin air. I directed the board's attention to Section 4 of the dossier. I told them this section detailed the specific theft of corporate funds used to finance Preston's personal romantic endeavors. I explained how he had deliberately falsified vendor invoices to a dummy logistics contractor. Those stolen corporate funds were immediately redirected into a private shell account. From there, the money was used to purchase a highly specific luxury item. I looked directly at Vanessa, who was standing frozen in her expensive heels. I pointed out the exact receipt from an exclusive diamond jeweler located in the city center. Preston had embezzled $600,000 of company payroll money to purchase the custom diamond necklace that was currently resting against Vanessa's collarbone. A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. Several directors turned their chairs to glare openly at Preston and Vanessa. The utter disgust on their faces was absolute. Arthur slammed his hand down flat against the mahogany table, the sharp sound making Preston flinch violently. Arthur demanded to know if the documentation was authentic. Harrison stepped forward smoothly, replacing my silence with his booming, authoritative legal voice. He assured the board that every single bank record, wire transfer, and falsified invoice had been rigorously verified by our independent auditors over the past 48 hours. Harrison stated that the evidence of gross financial misconduct was completely irrefutable. Preston tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He looked at Arthur desperately, hoping his lifelong family friend would somehow throw him a lifeline. He took a stumbling step forward toward the table, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He finally found his voice, whining that he was the victim of a targeted setup and claiming he had fully intended to repay the operational funds before the fiscal quarter ended. Nobody believed Preston's claim that he had intended to repay the money. Harrison asked the independent auditors to confirm their findings for the record. One by one, they stated that the transfers were authentic, the invoices were falsified, and the losses could not be explained as ordinary business judgment. The company's general counsel then confirmed that Apex Holdings possessed the temporary voting authority created by the default, and that the board had jurisdiction to remove an executive for gross misconduct. Arthur closed the dossier and looked around the table. The pity had disappeared from his face, replaced by cold, professional disgust. He asked Preston whether there was any verified evidence that contradicted the audit. Preston offered only accusations against me and promises of money he could not produce. Arthur waited until the silence became unbearable. Then he placed a formal motion before the directors terminate Preston immediately for concealment of debt, misuse of corporate funds, and breach of fiduciary duty. The vote began at the far end of the table. The chorus of agreements was swift and entirely unanimous. 14 voices echoed through the room, officially stripping Preston of his title, his authority, and his family legacy. Arthur declared the motion passed and stated that Preston was terminated for gross financial misconduct effective right this very second. The senior chairman then turned his attention back to me, silently deferring to my new absolute authority over the corporation. I offered Arthur a brief, respectful nod before shifting my cold gaze toward the doorway. Vanessa had shrunk back against the heavy mahogany doors, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She realized that her rich, powerful protector was now nothing but a destitute liability. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, smoothing the front of my sweater. I addressed Vanessa directly, my voice echoing clearly across the silent boardroom. I informed her that as the new chief executive officer of the corporation, my very first official act was to evaluate the public relations department. I told her that her newly acquired position as director of public relations was entirely redundant and completely unnecessary. I stated clearly that her department was being liquidated effective immediately. I told Vanessa she was officially fired. Her perfectly contoured face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. She opened her mouth to protest, perhaps to threaten a wrongful termination lawsuit, but a single sharp look from Harrison silenced her instantly. She knew she had absolutely no leverage here. I stepped away from the head of the table and walked slowly toward where they stood. The room remained dead silent, the only sound my steady footsteps against the thick carpet. I stopped a few feet away from Vanessa, looking directly at the glittering diamond jewelry resting around her neck. I kept my voice incredibly calm, but laced it with absolute undeniable authority. I told Vanessa that the necklace she was wearing was purchased with stolen corporate funds. I explained that it was not a romantic gift from a wealthy boyfriend, but rather a piece of stolen company property that rightfully belonged to Apex Holdings. I extended my hand, palm facing upward. I demanded she take it off and leave it on the table. Vanessa's hands shook violently as she reached behind her neck. She fumbled with the delicate platinum clasp, tears of pure humiliation spilling hot down her cheeks. The clasp finally released, and the heavy diamond piece slid off her skin. She dropped the glittering necklace onto the nearest edge of the mahogany table like it burned her. Without uttering a single word, she turned around and fled through the double doors, running away from the catastrophic mess she had helped create. I turned my attention back to the man who had arrogantly promised to leave me with absolutely nothing. The boardroom doors closed behind Vanessa, leaving Preston alone beneath the silent judgment of the directors he had betrayed. He dropped to his knees right there on the imported carpet. The man who had spent our entire marriage making me feel incredibly small was now physically shrinking himself before my eyes. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic prayer, tears streaming down his face as he begged me for mercy. He promised he would do anything to make it right. He offered to sign over his future earnings, begging me to let him keep his title, pleading with me to spare his mother the humiliation of losing her home. I looked down at my ex-husband without a single shred of pity. The well of empathy I had once reserved for him was completely bone dry. I did not raise my voice or offer him a final comforting lie. I simply pressed the small silver button under the edge of the mahogany table, to summon the building guards. The heavy double doors swung open moments later, and 4 uniformed security officers stepped into the tense boardroom. I calmly signaled for them to escort the trespassers off my property. The officers moved with swift professional efficiency, gripping Preston by his expensive suit jacket and hauling him to his feet. He thrashed and sobbed, his frantic pleas echoing down the 50th floor hallway as they dragged him toward the service elevator. The board members watched in stunned silence, completely motionless, as the legacy of their former chief executive officer was physically removed from the building. The empire he had arrogantly stolen from his father and recklessly gambled away was finally cleansed of his presence. I remained seated in my leather chair, taking a deep breath of the quiet air, feeling the absolute weight of my victory settle perfectly over my shoulders. The fallout over the next few weeks was remarkably swift and completely devastating for everyone who had tried to ruin me. Harrison and his team of ruthless corporate litigators unleashed an absolute avalanche of lawsuits against Preston. They systematically dismantled every single lie he had told, filing aggressive civil claims to recover the millions of embezzled corporate funds. The courts moved with terrifying speed, immediately freezing all of Preston's personal bank accounts, his offshore trusts, and his hidden investment portfolios. The moment the judge signed the asset freeze, the luxurious fantasy world Preston had constructed violently evaporated. Vanessa, realizing that the endless flow of designer gifts and lavish vacations was permanently cut off, did not even bother to say goodbye. The very day Preston's black luxury sports car was aggressively repossessed from the driveway of a cheap motel, Vanessa packed her bags. She abandoned him the exact moment his bank accounts were frozen, blocking his phone number and moving across the country with a wealthy real estate developer she had met during a public relations networking event. She left Preston completely alone, drowning in an ocean of toxic debt and facing the crushing reality of his criminal choices. He had traded his marriage and his family legacy for a woman who only loved the numbers on his bank statements. Beatrice suffered a remarkably similar fate, though her punishment was uniquely tailored to her immense arrogance. Without the massive family estate to anchor her social standing, she was completely exiled from the wealthy elite circles she had ruthlessly dominated for decades. Her wealthy friends, the same women who had sipped expensive champagne on her manicured lawns and gossiped about my inadequate pedigree, immediately stopped returning her phone calls. The final crushing blow to her massive ego came when she attempted to attend the annual spring gala at her beloved high society country club. The club's board of directors, terrified of being associated with Preston's massive corporate scandal and the public humiliation of the foreclosure, formally revoked her lifetime membership. She was entirely banished from the pristine dining rooms and lush golf courses that had defined her entire existence. Stripped of her money and her prestige, Beatrice was forced to move into a cramped, low-income apartment on the dusty outskirts of the city. The small unit smelled constantly of cheap bleach and old cooking grease, featuring peeling linoleum floors and a tiny window that looked out over a busy, noisy highway. She spent her days sitting in a worn fabric armchair, staring bitterly at the single pearl necklace she had managed to hide from the bankruptcy auditors, utterly isolated and consumed by the bitter reality of her spectacular downfall. Preston found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own arrogant creation. The massive legal debts from the lawsuits continued to multiply exponentially, creating a mountain of financial obligations he could never possibly escape. To appease the aggressive court-appointed debt collectors and avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence for corporate fraud, he was forced to secure immediate verifiable employment. The former chief executive officer, a man who had once commanded a towering glass corner office and dictated the fates of thousands, ended up working a grueling mid-level shift manager job in a loud, unair-conditioned shipping warehouse. His custom-tailored Italian suits were replaced by a stiff, scratchy neon orange safety vest and heavy steel-toed boots. He spent his long, miserable days standing on cracked concrete floors, shouting orders over the deafening roar of massive forklift engines and manually logging inventory shipments on a cheap plastic clipboard. His hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, grew rough and permanently stained with dark warehouse grime. Every single Friday, the vast majority of his meager paycheck was automatically garnished by the state and transferred directly into the accounts of Apex Holdings. I made sure he felt the crushing weight of his monumental betrayal with every heavy box he lifted and every grueling 12-hour shift he endured. He was permanently tethered to the company he had tried to destroy, working as a lowly subordinate to pay back the exact woman he had so arrogantly tried to leave with nothing. My revenge was not just loud and destructive, it was beautifully, quietly permanent. With Preston and his toxic enablers permanently eradicated from the corporate structure, I finally had the clear airspace needed to breathe life back into the suffocating logistics empire. The very next morning, I walked into the downtown headquarters, not as a vengeful ex-wife, but as the recognized chief executive officer with absolute authority. The atmosphere in the building was thick with nervous anticipation, the employees expecting a brutal purge. Instead, I initiated a comprehensive surgical restructuring designed to excise only the rot. Harrison and his legal team worked tirelessly alongside my auditors to identify every single manager and executive who had actively participated in Preston's fraudulent schemes or perpetuated his culture of intimidation. Within a week, the Human Resources Department processed 32 terminations. I did not yell, I did not gloat, and I did not offer explanations. I simply handed them their severance packages and had security escort them out of the glass doors. With the corporate parasites removed, a massive vacuum of leadership opened up, and I knew exactly who deserved to fill it. For years, Preston had routinely ignored, overworked, and emotionally abused the true backbone of his company. The brilliant mid-level managers, the dedicated warehouse supervisors, and the tireless logistics coordinators had been treated like disposable commodities while Preston siphoned their hard-earned profits to fund his lavish personal fantasies. I spent my first month conducting private one-on-one interviews with the staff members who actually understood the daily operations. I promoted Sarah, a brilliant supply chain analyst who had been repeatedly passed over for male candidates, directly to vice president of operations. I doubled the salaries of the regional dispatchers and instituted a comprehensive profit-sharing program that rewarded actual performance instead of family connections. The transformation within the company was nothing short of miraculous. Released from the constant fear of Preston's erratic temper and Vanessa's petty demands, the employees began to thrive. They worked with genuine dedication, bringing forward innovative efficiency strategies that had previously been ignored. Within 6 months, the logistics firm was not just stable, it was operating at a historic level of profitability. We secured massive international shipping contracts by proving our new commitment to ethical, transparent business practices. The financial turnaround was so swift and profound that industry publications began requesting interviews, wanting to understand how a previously failing enterprise had suddenly become the gold standard of the logistics sector. I politely declined all media requests. I had absolutely no desire to become a public spectacle or to flaunt my newly acquired wealth for the entertainment of strangers. My focus remained entirely on cultivating a healthy, sustainable corporate environment and ensuring that the people who worked for me felt valued and secure. We implemented comprehensive healthcare benefits, expanded parental leave, and created a comfortable collaborative workspace that encouraged genuine professional growth. The suffocating boys' club mentality that had defined the boardroom for 3 generations was permanently dismantled. In its place, I built a modern progressive institution that prioritized integrity over arrogance. As the company flourished, so did my own personal financial portfolio. Apex Holdings expanded its reach, quietly acquiring other distressed assets and turning them into profitable ethical ventures. I was generating wealth at a staggering rate, but money was no longer a tool for acquiring status or impressing high society elites. For me, financial capital simply meant total, undeniable independence. With the company firmly stabilized and my professional future completely secure, I finally decided it was time to establish a sanctuary of my own. I had absolutely no interest in returning to the suffocating suburban mansions or the sprawling high-maintenance estates that defined my previous life with Preston. Instead, I purchased a stunning ultra-modern penthouse apartment located in the very heart of the downtown financial district. It was a space I bought entirely with my own money, utilizing capital I had earned through my own strategic brilliance. The penthouse featured sweeping hardwood floors, minimalist architectural details, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. I decorated the space exactly as I pleased, selecting comfortable, elegant furniture, vibrant modern art, and thick, plush rugs. There were no antique vases to carefully dust, no pristine gardens to obsessively manicure, and absolutely no ghosts of family legacies haunting the pristine hallways. It was a home built on a foundation of absolute truth, a physical manifestation of the independent life I had so carefully and methodically constructed from the ashes of my ruined marriage. Exactly 1 year after the boardroom ambush that changed the entire trajectory of my existence, I stood quietly on the expansive glass balcony of my new penthouse. A cool, crisp evening breeze drifted through the air as the city below me pulsed with vibrant, endless energy. I held a cup of chamomile tea, feeling the warmth radiating against my palms. I thought about Beatrice sitting bitterly in her cramped apartment, entirely stripped of the country club prestige she had valued above human connection. I thought about Vanessa chasing her next wealthy benefactor, dependent on the fleeting generosity of arrogant men. I thought about Preston sweating in a loud warehouse, permanently chained to a minimum wage existence because he arrogantly underestimated the woman he married. Then I let them all fade completely from my mind. The journey from betrayal to triumph had fundamentally reshaped my understanding of the world and my place within it. I looked out over the glittering horizon, finally at peace with the profound realization that true power never requires screaming intimidation or cruelty. It requires infinite patience, meticulous strategy, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing your exact worth, especially when everyone else assumes you have absolutely nothing left to your name. The undeniable truth was remarkably simple, yet it had taken me a lifetime of being overlooked to finally understand it. It comes from having the vision to see potential where others see nothing, the courage to defend what is yours, and the wisdom to know when to hold firm and when to let go. A week after the anniversary of the takeover, I visited the former estate one final time. The mansion was gone. In its place stood a fenced construction site, stacks of steel survey markers, and the first foundations of the commercial complex that would eventually occupy the land. The destruction did not bring me the satisfaction Beatrice had feared. It brought something quieter, proof that even the most intimidating symbols lose their power once you stop worshipping them. Near the edge of the property, the developer had preserved a row of old maple trees. I stood beneath them while trucks moved across the earth where the ballroom had once stood. For years, I had believed endurance meant remaining calm, while other people diminished me. I understood now that endurance without boundaries was only another form of surrender. I returned to the city and signed the final documents establishing an employee education fund through Apex Holdings. It would pay for logistics training management courses and professional certifications for workers who had been denied opportunities under Preston's leadership. The first recipients included warehouse employees, whose overtime he had once cut to finance his vacations. That decision mattered more to me than the foreclosure, the board vote, or the headlines Preston desperately wanted to avoid. I had not reclaimed power merely to punish the people who misused it. I had reclaimed it so their damage would not become the model for what came next. That evening, I returned to my penthouse, opened the balcony doors, and let the city air fill the room. I no longer needed Preston, Beatrice, or Vanessa to understand what they had underestimated. Their judgment had no role in the life I was building. The company was stable, my home was peaceful, and my future belonged entirely to me. Share your own experiences of standing up to toxic expectations and proving your worth in the comments below. If this tale of strategic triumph and ultimate independence resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming life's toughest betrayals. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that sometimes what others see as worthless holds the greatest value of all.